And of course, there was Krishna, who was the charioteer to Arjuna, who was the great symbol of the spiritual seeker. And Krishna as the charioteer represents the higher self. And Arjuna is paralyzed with indecision on the battlefield because he has to fight his family. And this is a classic kind of deeply spiritual story. And so basically, however, overall, the forces of materialism won that battle. And humanity has been, despite the many liberations of various human souls since that time, this planet has been controlled by those forces.
Phillip, Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Boo. Good to be here.
Good to have you. You're like a hero of mine, so I appreciate you being on. I wanted to ask you about the book, one of your books, Unveiling Genesis.
Mm-hmm. This one here.
A lot of my listeners may not have heard of your book, and I will be putting that on my link below. You talk about, you challenge the timeline of human history. Let's see if you would love to touch on that. And what's the importance of understanding the timeline?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, originally this book was called The Hidden History of Humanity. That was the first book that I wrote back in, I printed it in 2005. And I was never happy with the arrangement of all the material in it. And so around about 2015, I rewrote the whole thing and named it as the Unveiling Genesis, Mysteries of the Root Races and Cycles. Prior to that, I'd done about probably 20 years research in Blavatsky and Bailey's material, H.P. Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, Alice Bailey and her works, indexing all the books that were written by both those authors as per the cycles, the root races, the sub-races, anything to do with this theme. So, and I wrote the script for the video, The Hidden History of Humanity, in 2012, and we recorded it with my video editor in Los Angeles. But then I got distracted for about 5 years and traveling and so forth. And then we got the video together in 2017 and finally put it out on YouTube, and it's been there for about 6 years now, and it's got about 10 million plus views. So far more than we ever expected. And so my main angle with this is to, as the subject of one of my essays says, is to find the correct time of history. And so I use Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine as my main reference, who used all the Hindu or the Vedic teachings and the timelines in that. Of course, she was had all this work transmitted to her by one of the Masters of Wisdom, or several Masters of Wisdom actually, the Master Dwarsh Kul, the Tibetan, the Master Moya, the Master Kutumi. All these beings are custodians or shohans of the so-called seven rays, which is part of the esoteric astrology discipline that I'm deeply involved in as well. So, and so with these ridiculous timelines of in exoteric science of 4,000 BC or 10,000 years ago for human evolution, we was very primitive for many millennia, and then suddenly we became fully blown, civilized, sophisticated civilization. So, and even the so-called New Age archaeologists don't take the timeline too much further back than exoteric science. Thankfully, in the last few years, exoteric science has taken it back to 200,000 years to a million years, depending on what they're looking at in the world. But no one has really embraced fully yet the 21 million year timeline that I'm proposing for human individualization, as it's called, back in Lemurian times, in the on the Lemurian continent. The Lemurian continent that was prior to the Atlantean continents. So I'm not sure that I covered all those aspects of your first question there, but I'll let you jump in and qualify that if you wish.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You find the serpent symbology throughout the Americas and other parts of the world. What's the meaning of the serpent symbol? I know growing up in the West, I'm taught that it's the devil or Satan. But in other esoteric teachings, you hear about the knowledge and wisdom.
Yes. Well, in Europe, I've just been doing some work preparing for my visit to France, and I'm going to Brittany to visit Karnak, where all the standing stones are. There's thousands of standing stones there. And the people who built them were initiates and called themselves serpents or dracontia, as in dragon. They were all over Europe, all over the world, in fact, South America, North America, you name it. Because in ancient times there were, of course, different continents and different positions in the Atlantic Ocean. There was a land bridge between Brittany and Britain, from the northwestern part of France to Britain. You could walk across. There wasn't an English channel as such. And these beings were actually from the Egyptian civilization in Europe anyway. They traveled north into Europe as initiates, as very precise mathematicians and astronomers and astrologers as well. They had all these arts. And according to Blavatsky, Stonehenge and Karnak are identical places for for aligning with various stars, constellations, equinox and solstice positions, and so forth. So we're talking millions of years of human evolution, and it's very hard when we look at all the different ruins in different places in the world to establish what timelines they're on. Some of them might be just as old as maybe 10 or 20,000 years. Some of them might be 800,000 years. Others, a couple of million years. So we have inadequate ways of dating, which I talk about in one of my essays, and which is something I want to investigate further. So I think a lot of the timelines of the New Age archaeologists are flawed as much as the exoteric scientists whom they criticize quite frequently. So my work is about sticking to the ageless wisdom mysteries that have been given through the secret doctrine, and trying to bridge to exoteric science and the latest findings that are coming out, say to do with the dating of rocks and geographical elements of temples and so forth, the ruins. And that's a fairly long process, but I have one of the chapters in my book is on geology, is on the timelines that Blavatsky gives, and she compares them with the geological or knowledge of the time when she wrote The Secret Doctrine, which was in the late 19th century, in the 1880s. So a lot of that's changed now. There's been more information, of course, which is great. But I think that what a lot of the and I'm not being critical of these so-called New Age archaeologists. I know some of them. I've met them. They've done fantastic work in their own spheres. But they tend to stay within a truncated timeline of about 12,000 or 25,000 years. It's a very neat sort of little package that they don't go outside of. And in the essay that I wrote, that what's it called? It's About Time, I think I used to call it. I talk about how these precession cycles of 26,000 years that these researchers stay within, they can add many multiples of those precession cycles going back hundreds of thousands or millions of years to get a far more accurate timeline. And this is corroborated many times in the Secret Doctrine and the various works of Blavatsky, the collected writings, which is about another, I think it's 16 volumes or 14 volumes. Another book called Isis Unveiled, which is her first writing, which is a very complex book. In fact, both of them should be rewritten, and people have done abridged versions of both those books because there is so much in there to untangle. They've been deliberately written in a way to veil the secret information, to make you use your intuition. And that's why I spent about 20 years indexing, going through each one quite carefully to extract the information and then put it back together in a different way.
So in India, ancient India, they talk about the Nagas. Is that the similar connection with the serpent?
Yeah, it's the serpent of wisdom. Of course, the serpent is associated with the Kundalini energy that lays coiled at the base of the spine. You can have a serpent of materialism or a serpent of wisdom. And so there is the two paths of black and white magic that are associated with serpents, hence the superstition or the fear that goes with that's been compounded by the Christian doctrine and so forth. So
even in the Bible, it says,
be wise as serpents.
Yeah.
Exactly. And all the great figures of the Bible were initiates. Noah was the Manu of the fifth root race. Vivasvata Manu, as is called in the Hindu tradition, and I make these comparisons in my book between the biblical patriarchs and the 10 biblical patriarchs and the 10 Manus of the different sub-races and root races. And how, in fact, that the numbers given in Genesis, hence Unveiling Genesis, the title of the book, of the ages of these patriarchs are actually code for the ages of the Manus, or the particular sub-races and root races for which they were the archetype of the ideal human being to achieve in consciousness and physical form for each of those sub-races. And so I detail in the it's like a proof, in a sense, the Genesis teachings, some of which have been taken from the Hindu teachings, a lot of it, in fact, prove separately, just through the patriarch timelines that I give, the Hindu Manu timelines. So there are lots of references to dates and times and throughout the Secret Doctrine that gave me kind of time markers to work with, and I was able to fill in the gaps in between those particular sub-races. I go right back, in fact, briefly into cosmic history. I talk about the rounds and chains and schemes, that this planet is called a scheme, as are all the other planets in our solar system. It's not just the physical planet you see. It's a system of worlds or globes and chains that are in etheric matter, that are invisible, but which represent the evolution of consciousness for each planet. And so I start at that sort of highest level possible and work my way down through the chapters in this book, to explain basically how we came into being, how the solar system came into being, the particular karma of the Earth scheme and the Earth chain, and where we are in time. For instance, we're in the fourth globe of the fourth chain of the fourth Earth scheme. And the Atlantean root race just before this fifth root race is called the fourth root race. So a lot of fours there. And we can also bring in the idea of the fourth cosmic path, which is the path to Sirius, which after human beings have liberated themselves on this planet, most of them will go to another evolution and start all over again on a higher turn of the evolutionary spiral in the system of Sirius, which is essentially the higher self to the solar system as a whole. And of course, the many temples and menhirs and dolmens and pyramids and so forth are aligned to Sirius, or Draco, as in dragon, and the Orion and so forth.
I was recently in a anthropology club at the local college over here, and they were making fun of me about Atlantis because I was the only one that brought it up or believed in it, or that it was possible. But the whole club, the whole group everyone was making fun of anyone who believed in Atlantis and Lemuria.
That's unfortunate, because
do you believe that was real?
In academia, all those things have been ridiculed. And it's funny because I used to work in metaphysical bookstores in Australia, and I found out when I was working in those stores that books on Atlantis are the most that have ever been written about any subject. It's extraordinary. There are just thousands of books on Atlantis. And yes, of course, it existed. It was quite often these books actually say, however, that we have found Atlantis here or here, when in fact the Atlantean continents were strewn around the entire planet, most of which, in terms of the main civilization, were in the eastern part of the United States and the Atlantic Ocean. So there were quite large continents or island continents between Europe and the United States, between Europe and South America. But the Lemurian landforms and continents and the Atlantean landforms and continents are the subject of my next book called Geography and Giants, which attempts to locate or to trace out or map where those continents were and where their remnants are today. For instance, Australia is the largest remaining continent of Lemuria, which is a continent that stretched right across the Pacific Ocean to South America at one stage, and also in the other direction towards Africa. So, the science still ridicules a lot of the metaphysical information. They say it's just fantasy. And yet there are many, many proofs for Atlantean ruins all around the world, thousands and thousands of proofs that can't be ignored. But if you're stuck in that straitjacket of thinking, it's unfortunate, because it's also affected the so-called New Age archaeologists who still work within that paradigm and won't venture too much further outside the timelines that they work with.
They found a lot of structures in like Guatemala area with the LiDAR technology we have, and they still haven't dug anything up. Is it because they don't have money, or they don't want to dig it up and change the timeline?
Probably a financial thing in places like Central America. I was in Mexico a few years ago and had a wonderful trip for 6 weeks around the country, visiting all the pyramids and places of interest. And I need to go back for just a separate trip just to Guatemala, because I realized when I was there in Mexico, I thought, I'm going to need another trip for this, because there's so much there. So it's very exciting that the LiDAR technology is being used and so much more stuff is being found. Likewise, in the middle of the Amazon forest, they're finding more and more structures and buildings and so forth. So there's so much that hasn't been revealed yet, and a lot has been buried as well through flood, through cataclysm, through earthquake, and so forth. So all these things will be revealed, we're told, in the near future, in the Aquarian Age, in the next 2,000 years. Vast tracts of land across Central Asia, from the Gobi Desert in the east, right across Central Asia to the west, they'll be finding buried cities and so forth. And we already have, discoveries in Turkey and places like that of some of these places, but not like apparently what is going to be revealed in the future.
You mentioned the flood story, and you mentioned that in your book in depth. Every culture had a flood story, basically.
Yeah.
Like the biblical text, Noah. And it's also in ancient India, the Sumerian tablets, Mesoamerica. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, just before I do, we need to go back to the time of individualization soon in Lemuria, and we can work our way forward if you like. But each root race has been destroyed by fire or water. Lemuria was destroyed by fire and sunk as a result of volcanic activity. Atlantis was destroyed by water. And this fifth root race that we're in now, because we're talking about third, fourth, and fifth root races, as they're called occultly, will be destroyed by fire, volcanic activity, and earthquakes again. And we'll probably see in the next couple of thousand years much more increased activity around the world, and places like Britain will, for instance, will cease to exist. It will sink beneath the waves as new continents come up and old continents go down. But coming back to your precise question again, what was what was it that you actually asked?
The flood story.
Oh, the floods. Yeah, I'm sorry. I do tend to go off on tangents, but the Atlantean flood was 4 floods over a period of 4 million years, and the first major flood came after the major war in Atlantis, the first Mahabharata. There's a couple of other Mahabharatas or great wars in the Hindu tradition, but almost 4 million years ago, after that war between the forces of light and the forces of materialism, essentially, the earth was cleansed by water, you could say, and the raining for 40 days and 40 nights and so forth, all that kind of thing. Created this flood where the remnants of humanity survived only on mountaintops. So the story of Noah is literal and symbolic. There are many different symbologies there. And Noah, or Vivasvata Manu, was the new archetype or the ideal kind of, he represented the ideal human or archetype for the fifth root race. The fourth root race, which was Atlantis, was in its latter sub-race stages when it was flooded. In fact, this is around what I call the 4.4.4, the fourth branch race of the fourth sub-race of the fourth root race, that this destruction happened. This was the deepest sort of incarnation into matter for the entire planetary scheme, chain, and globe that I referred to before. And I have various chapters in my book that describe this, and also in my video, Hidden History of Humanity. I do briefly describe it, and I have diagrams to illustrate. So that was the first big flood that wiped millions of people off the face of the earth. And of course, they were still gigantic in their form nature. Let's see, 20 to 30 feet, or 15 to 30 feet, depending on what part of the world. So you're talking 5 to 10 meters in height. When I come back to the Lemurian part, we'll work our way forward in a minute. I can elaborate more on this. So many of the skeletons were eroded by the action of sand on the ocean floor. But there's been much skeletal evidence found all over the world, but has been hidden or covered up or reinterred due to cultural customs and so forth. Many accounts of in the last 5 centuries of the Spanish in South America and North America, for instance, and various tribes they came in contact with. So anyway, the second flood was about 860,000 years ago, and this corresponded to the second subrace of the fifth root race. But again, I need to go back and give a sequence that moves from Lemuria forward for the listeners. I think it'll be easier to understand. The third flood was about 270,000 years ago, and the last flood was the sinking of Poseidonus, the last island just off the coast of Africa, about 13,000 years ago. So 4 floods. But when we talk about Atlantis, there's also Atlantean consciousness. And there's fifth root race or Aryan consciousness, Aryan being a Hindu word, of course. So Atlantean consciousness is basically emotionally focused with not too much mental development. Apparently about 75% of the population of the world today is still based in Atlantean consciousness. But there's a rapid awakening taking place, as I also point out regularly. So, but we have in this culmination of this fifth root race, which I call the 5.5.5, the fifth branch, the fifth sub of the fifth root, which is the Northern European, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic combination, where there has been. It doesn't mean that everyone has reached a point of mental expansion and unfoldment, but there's a certain percentage that hold it for the rest of the race, so to speak. So, so really, I should go back to the time of individualization, Boo-Boo. So if the root races, there are 7 root races for every one of these globe periods I was talking about before. And there are various rounds or cycles, immensely long cycles that we've been through already. There's the first round, the second round, the third round, the fourth round. We are in the 4th round at the moment, and we are in the 5th root race of the 4th round. The first 3.5 or 3.5 root races were etheric in nature. There was the seed of the developing human, and it was only halfway through the 3rd root race, the Lemurian root race, as it's being called, about 21.5 million years ago. There's been some very exact numbers given for this, by the way, that human beings who were hitherto members of the animal kingdom, in human type of bodies, not like the ones we have today, more perhaps ape-like, who wandered in tribes and who cohabited the planet with dinosaurs and all the other gigantic animals at that time. And so what happened in the cycle and karma of the planetary logos, the being that inhabits this planet, a planned evolution took place of the unfoldment of consciousness, of the getting of wisdom, so to speak. And so this planet was seeded by beings within our evolution, within these globes and chains of the Earth scheme, that have a direct connection to the Venus scheme. Venus is like the highest self or sister to this planet. And these so-called Lords of Flame, 108 of them, which is a very esoteric number based on the fifth harmonic, visited this planet. And their presence surrounding this planet was so intense that it created an electrical storm. And I don't know how long this storm lasted for. It could have been a few thousand years. Or it might have been 10 years or 100, I don't know. I've never found that out because there are some exact timing and dates around that time too. But essentially, that destroyed most of the animal kingdom at that time. That was the true death of the dinosaurs, which is exoterically dated at 60 million years ago. But the esoteric timing for it is around about 21.5 million years ago. And so the destruction of all the animal forms created, there was a magnetic sort of, field set up at that time, and a configuration between certain planets such as Mercury and Venus that allowed the seeding of consciousness and for for human beings to reincarnate in roughly the same bodies they had before when they were part of the animal kingdom, but with souls, with causal bodies, as we call it, causal body. And that was the beginning of the start of evolution for humanity, as we know it today, the unfoldment of consciousness since that time. And it happened over a period of about 3 million years between the third subrace of Lemuria and the fifth subrace of Lemuria, and the final stages of individualization was created. It's an amazing story. I'd love to make a massive movie about this one day that's based on the documentary that I made. Because we have to use our imagination quite a bit to accurately, or to get some sort of vision of what they look like and so forth. But some groups of these what we call earth chain souls were slower than others. They needed more work. There were certain assistants or a hierarchy of spiritual beings who oversaw this individualization process, and some groups of souls needed more work than others. They were all on different ray lines. I talk about the 7 rays. There were several different groups of souls on different rays. The first ray of will of power, second ray of love wisdom, the third ray of active intelligence. Most of them were on the ray of love wisdom. Their causal bodies were on that. And that is in fact, for the most of humanity today, the majority are on the second ray of love wisdom. And there are particular reasons for that. But suffice to say, in those latter subraces of Lemuria, the guides of the race assisted the fledgling humanity to evolve, and that's how they were taught agriculture, fishing, building, all those kind of things. Apparently some of the first lava and rock cities were built in the area we know as Madagascar today, but they haven't been found. They're buried, but they will be found one day. That's a good place to take the LiDAR instrument to. And so, but also at that time, when at the 3.5 or the fifth subrace, the 5 being the number of mind too, by the way, and the number of Venus, at that culmination, it also seeded the Atlantean root race. And so about 17 million years ago, the Atlantean root race came into being, which was a different quality of human being, a different type. And both those root races lived in parallel for many millions of years. The Lemurian root race up to about 4 million years ago. I was talking about the individualization time in Lemuria, between the
In the
third and fifth
Lantians.
subraces of Lemuria over a 3 million year period, and how, in fact, during that period was the seed, the fourth subrace, in fact, between the third and the fifth subrace, was the seed of the fourth root race, Atlantis. And those two
Yeah.
civilizations um, uh, basically inhabited the Earth in parallel with each other for many millions of years. Lemurians right up to about 4 million years ago, just before the Atlantean cataclysm, actually, about 700,000 years before the Atlantean cataclysm, the Lemurian continent was destroyed by fire. And there were various reasons for that too, because the evolution had not gone according to plan. And so in Atlantis, I mean, these civilizations fought with each other and intermingled with each other. This is very kind of there was a lot of interbreeding, intermingling between these races for a long, long time, but they were essentially different. And the reason why is because of the two main types of souls on this planet, so-called moon chain souls and the earth chain souls. The earth chain souls incarnated in Lemuria, but the moon chain souls were those who individualized on the previous moon chain, the previous chain to this fourth earth chain, the third chain or the moon chain, which was a failure, a systemic failure that was basically shut down by the so-called solar logos, our being who inhabits this entire solar system. So in Atlantis, in the early subraces of Atlantis, these moon chainers, as I collectively refer to them as, started to incarnate and coming in large numbers. They were far more advanced in their intellect, in their consciousness, than the Lemurian earth chain. And they also brought the karma of the failure of the moon chain in with them. So in those first few subraces, there were fabulous developments of technology, civilization, and so forth that this advanced consciousness of the moon chain is brought in. And of course, they were still being assisted by the guides of the race. They had technologies gifted to them, just like you'd give a gift to a young child, because they were still young, as relatively speaking, as souls. So let's hop back to Lemuria again, because what happened in Lemuria that went against the plan of evolution was that the newly individualized humanity, who just basically had the low spark of mind, so to speak, basically the main chakras in the body were the base chakra, the sacral chakra, and so forth, the lower centers. So the point of least resistance was to mate with anything that moved, and so essentially humans bred with animals at that time, or with other monsters, bearing in mind that they were giants, they were great cumbersome giants that hadn't really fully affected the coordination of the etheric and the physical bodies. Hence the first yoga was introduced, Hatha Yoga, which was their spiritual goal, if you like. And so what happened with this interbreeding with the animal kingdom is that it produced the apes and all sorts of other combinations that Plato and others talk about, with humans with the head of a dog and people with 6 arms and all sorts of exotic hybrid creatures. And so the guides of the race, in fact, struck those subraces with sterility, so they couldn't continue along this line of that wasn't in line with the plan, so to speak, the planetary plan. Anyway, but the first candidates for initiation from the Earth Chain humanity in Lemuria were 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 assembled and guided through taking the first initiation in the various temples. And one of those first temples was the Temple of Ibez in South America, which I think was around the center of current South America, because back then it was a far different continent. It was just the northern portion of it that existed as a Lemurian continent, in fact. So this was the first Shambhala, the center where the will of God is known, as it's called. You've probably heard of Shambhala, I take it. And this is where the being known as Sanakumara, or the Ancient of Days, or Melchizedek, is anchored on this planet as the personality expression of the great being we call the planetary Logos. Being who is the personality, so it is like his front man, so to speak. But of course, these temples for initiation were in other places around the planet, other Lemurian continents, different soul groups in different places, and so forth. So I'm giving you very broad brushstrokes here of the evolution. But so there were all these various problems that started, but of course there were successes with the evolution of the Lemurians, and likewise in Atlantis. But in Atlantis, coming to these later subraces between about 10 million years ago and 4 million years ago, things started to go awry, and particularly around about 4.5 million years ago, when the planet was reaching its deepest incarnation into matter as far as evolution is concerned. The fourth round, the fourth chain, the fourth globe, the fourth root race, the fourth subrace, the fourth branch race, etc. It's like a coming down into in a kind of a sweep like this and going back up again. And we're on the upward arc now. And the guides of the race, or the masters of wisdom, the so-called Great White Brotherhood or hierarchy, were watching how energies were being abused at the time. So the greatest crime in Atlantis was theft of other people's property, theft of land, and also sex magic. So the forces of materialism were gathering strength at that time, and the masters of wisdom had to draw a line in the sand and say, this is the way of light, this is the way of materialism, humanity, make your choice. We're at a similar stage right now, in fact, in this fifth root race. And so this story is depicted beautifully in the Mahabharata, which I have a 6-minute clip from in my documentary, the Peter Brook version of the Mahabharata, which has been beautifully acted by stage actors and captured the true spirit of the conflict at that time. King Pandu and his 5 sons, who represent the Manus, or the future subraces of the fifth root race, and other characters in the story being the Atlantean kings. And all this took place in the western part of India. And of course there was Krishna, who was the charioteer to Arjuna, who was the great symbol of the spiritual seeker. And Krishna, as the charioteer, represents the higher self. And Arjuna is paralyzed with indecision on the battlefield because he has to fight his family. And this is a classic kind of deeply spiritual story. And so basically, however, overall, the forces of materialism won that battle. And humanity has been, despite the many liberations of various human souls since that time, this planet has been controlled by those forces. And it was soon after that time that the Atlantean flood occurred, and the the Manu Vaivasvata Manu came in, had the ark. There were probably several arks, and gathered the animals two by two. Now, I think this is more a metaphor for human beings, but they probably gathered up animals as well. They gathered up the remnants of humanity, as one master put it, in spite of themselves, because humanity at the time was very recalcitrant. It wasn't willing to change its bad old ways. So Noah traveled around rescuing the remnants of humanity on the high mountaintops and so forth. I'm not sure how much the percentage of the human population was wiped off the earth, but it was quite a large percentage. And as far as we can work out, the Manu took these survivors, and they may have done many ferry trips on the ark, going backwards and forwards into the Himalayas, where they were kept for several million years, for about 3 million years, and a new race was developed, the so-called fifth root race. And the first sub-race of that fifth root race is the Hindu sub-race, who were released, if you like, down into India about 1 million years ago. So these are incredible timelines, I know, because we've all been growing up with such much shorter timelines. It's just really, quite often people dismiss these timelines. But I think if they give some thought to them and reflection, they are quite coherent and logical, given the overall massive timeline for evolution. And so India that first subrace was the foundation of all the Western subraces that came after. The second subrace was the Egyptians, but also the ancient Cambodians, Angkor Wat temples in those places. Same technology, same consciousness. And there were various branch races, of course, with this first Hindu subrace. So this is where the Sumerians come in, and the various Western subraces that are talked about, such as the Anunnaki and so forth, are all around about that time. And that's one area that I'm going to go into far more deeply in the near future, because I see a lot of crazy stuff written about the Anunnaki. But with many threads of truth going through it, of course. But it is a fact, and Blavatsky does say this, that we have had visitors at various cycles throughout our long history that have come to this planet, have helped guide humanity, have left their monuments, their highly sophisticated pyramids or whatever, and then have gone. And then they've checked back in another 25,000 years later to see how we're doing, that kind of thing. So then after the Egyptian subrace that came into being about 800,000 years ago, at the same time as the second flood, that second flood was the major wiping out of the remnants of most of the Atlantean giants. Okay, and so the Egyptian subrace came into being around that time. And they came from India. The Mayans and the Egyptians, the Mayans also being part of this second subrace with the Cambodians, originated in the southern part of India, which was the old, what's it called? One of the names is called Kandi Kamaram, which is the continent south of the state of Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka. It went right down, embracing the Maldives Islands and so forth, and also further out towards Africa. That was part of the old Lemurian continent. But at that time, it had become an Atlantean continent as an extension of India. And the Egyptians and the Mayans came from that southern part, which is also called Dravidian. They were much darker in the south than in the north, where they had lighter skin, and hence the darker skin of the Egyptians. The Egyptians sailed to across the ocean and maybe island hopped their way to the source of the Nile. So right up there in the what's that place called? Can't remember what it's called. There's a couple of states around there, but anyway, and they gradually worked their way down the Nile over hundreds of thousands of years to where their latest monuments are. But there's probably a lot of other monuments that haven't been discovered yet between there and the lower part of the Nile. Whereas the Mayans kept going west and island hopped their way across the Atlantic, sailing, and eventually came to Central America, Guatemala, southern Mexico, and so forth, Yucatan. And of course, had the similar technology of pyramids and so forth, great astronomical knowledge. So this second subrace was like a bridge between Atlantis and the fifth root race. They really were. Blavatsky says in one part that they may have had their genesis about 2 million years before in the latter subraces of Atlantis, bridging to the first subraces of the fifth root race. You see, there's always overlap. It's not linear back-to-back kind of cycles. Time is spiralic. So they were the bridge between the old Atlantean magical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, and so forth, and but essentially they were fifth root race in their consciousness. So, and of course, then the latter subraces that came after, as I explain in my book, each Manu or patriarch of a subrace, a short period into its life, creates a seed for the next subrace. And I have various diagrams that explain this. So one subrace will be living out its life, but another subrace is already overlapping and coming into its nascent evolution, and then its more physically manifested being. So we have to think of these overlapping of cycles, overlapping of root races, overlapping of subraces, overlapping of branch races, and so forth. So the third subrace was the Arabic Semitic subrace. And that came into being about 600,000 years ago. Then a few 100,000 years later, the Celtic subrace, the fourth subrace, came into being. And then Celtic Latin. Then the fifth subrace, the Teutonic Nordic, came in about 100,000 years ago. Then the branch races of that subrace came into being, leading up to the fifth branch race, I should say, the Anglo-Saxon. Now we have just in the last few centuries entered into a sixth branch race, which was seeded by the USA. And the USA, as the sixth branch race in consciousness, is going to be the seed of the sixth root race, which will come into being in about 25,000 years' time, we are told, in Brazil. And so we've gone full circle with Shambhala, because the Shambhala center in South America is still active, but it will be reactivated in the next 25,000 years as this new race comes about. So what we have in the fifth root race, at the epitome of the fifth root race, the peak of the fifth root race, the 5.5.5, is a great sort of flowering of mind, expansion of consciousness. But in the sixth root race, the intuition, or buddhi, or direct knowledge, will be the next evolution, which is getting much closer towards the stage of human liberation. So, covered a lot of ground there, but
yeah.
there's the kind of a broad, quick overview coming from individualization forward. And of course, the human bodies changed from gigantic. They basically diminished in parallel with the dinosaurs or the reptile kingdom. Over, from gigantic 20, 30, 40 feet Tyrannosaurus Rex or whatever, pretty much in parallel to the human size today. In fact, Blavatsky tells us that human beings in Lemuria fought the dinosaurs because they were gigantic themselves. They were as big as the dinosaurs, and they fought them off. They probably fought them before individualization when they were in these various humanoid kind of tribes, living side by side with the animal kingdom of that time. But there was, even after individualization and the death of the majority of the reptile kingdom, there was still plenty of them around. So, in fact, even right up until, even till today, really, in terms of some of the relics that still exist, but more so in the last 100,000 years, easily.
So growing up in.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to mention growing up in San Pedro, California. About in the Catalina Island, right across from San Pedro, they found a lot of skeleton bones that were giants. Were all like 8 feet tall.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that? And was that what, like, the Atlanteans or the Lemurians connection there?
Yeah, because USA was one of the largest Atlantean centers. The West Coast was also part of Lemuria at one stage. So Hawaii, California was also part of Lemuria at one stage. But most of the USA and the Indian tribes there are the remnants of the Atlanteans. They are the latter part. The American Indians and the Tibetans, for instance, are part of the seventh subrace of the fourth root race of Atlantis. And there have been interesting books written about the similarities between the ceremonies, religious ceremonies that both those cultures have. And so, there are many sacred sites and powerful magnetic spots in the USA due to the all those tribes inhabiting it for literally millions of years. And the American Indians of today are the latter remnants of the most recent evolution of the Atlanteans. And they have a lot of the Atlantean wisdom as well that they brought with them. So, but there are many accounts of the Spanish missionaries and so forth in North and South America meeting some of these tribes. I think one in South America, there was an Indian chief who was 15 feet in height. I think it was in Paraguay or somewhere or Uruguay, somewhere like that. And these are quite feasible, honest accounts by all intents and purposes, written by priests or some of the missionaries who went out there to convert the heathens, and so even up until 2,000 years ago, there are many accounts of there's a guy called Maximus, of course, the Roman emperor. I think he was about 4 meters or 12 feet in height. They found bones in various caves in the Grand Canyon, which you're probably aware of. Large western type of mummies with long red hair, many in South America with long red hair, but far more Western looking rather than the indigenous South Americans that we know of today, like the Aymara and so forth. So there's so much evidence, and even there's one story of the fossilized remains of two giants in a riverbed in the Grand Canyon. A lot of the Grand Canyon, of course, is out of bounds. You can't go to different parts of it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly why. Possibly because of repression of all these kind of findings. There was a male and female skeleton, as I recall. One was about 18 feet in length, and the other one was 23 feet. And they were fossilized in the rock in the bed of the river. There were many other explorers who went out and found similar type of things with and artifacts, of course, which many other authors have well documented.
That's interesting. Yeah, you brought up Cambodia. Even in Ohio, we get that the serpent mount that's 4 football fields long. If you were to straighten out the snake serpent, right?
Yes.
And you find the same symbology, the serpent in Cambodia. Was that like the logo, like we have in flags for different countries today? Was that like their symbol? Just interesting.
Very powerful.
Well, you have any last words? Looks like we're running out of time.
Okay. We've just scratched the surface, really. So all I can say is go to my YouTube channel if you want to, Phillip Lindsay. Watch the documentary, 2 hours, 37 minutes. Maybe watch it over a few nights because there's a lot to take in. And you can find, if English is not your first language, you can find most European languages there, translated by people, not machines, and also Chinese and Vietnamese, Russian, French. The only main language missing in Europe is German, I think. But most of the other main European languages are there: Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and so forth. And that will give you a good overview. Some people have told me they've watched it 50 times. It takes a while to really come to terms with some of these concepts. This is the nature of the ageless wisdom. And if you want to go deeper, then get the book. It's quite a thick one. It's divided into 2 books and has a lot of diagrams and tables and quotations from the Secret Doctrine in it. It's not an easy book to read, but it has. I've made it as easy as possible. So the first book, The Hidden History of Humanity, don't waste your money on that because second-hand dealers on Amazon charge ridiculous prices for it. But this one is much better. It's much more cohesive.
Yeah, thank you. I'll definitely put it on my link, and it's a beautiful book. I have to get spoon-fed with it, the knowledge, but I love it, and I appreciate you coming on.
Sure.
Hopefully we can do this again.